Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to talk about some of the short stories I read this week here at the start of Short Story Summer. I'll leave all the details about this reading event down in my description box, and it's never too late to join if you're interested. At the start of the month, after thinking it over, I made the decision not to follow the very clever bingo type board with all its interesting prompts. Instead, I made a decision to read a lot of 20th century stories, some that I hadn't read yet, and some that I really wanted to reread. One of the stories I read this week is from the very late 19th century, but all the rest are from the 20th. I started the month with the very first story that Virginia Woolf published from the year 1917, The Mark on the Wall. This is a story of a writer, someone we assume is not only a woman, but a stand-in for Woolf herself. The character sees a mark on the wall, a few inches above the mantelpiece, and she becomes intrigued with it. She says, "How readily our thoughts swarm upon a new object." And over the course of the story, she considers what it might be, sometimes thinking about it relatively objectively. Could it be a mark made by a small nail? But then her mind begins to go off in all sorts of creative directions. Perhaps it was a miniature that was hung on the nail. Perhaps it pictured a woman with white powdered curls and lips like red carnations. She considers who might have hung the imaginary miniature too. And soon she goes on to other possibilities, other imaginings. Eventually, she says she'll have to get up and see for herself what the mark is, and then immediately she holds back. "No, I refuse to be beaten," and she won't move. For much of the story, she's thinking not about the mark itself, but about her thinking, and her time alone to be able to do that thinking. And then suddenly someone is standing over her, someone that she clearly knows well and is unsurprised to see in her private room, who we might assume is her spouse. And he is on his way out to purchase a newspaper, perhaps with war news. And then he spots the mark and immediately states what it is, or rather what he assumes it is. For the reader of the story, it's not actually clear that this is the truth, only that he says it with certainty. And that's the end of the story. Although we don't actually know the gender of either of the two characters, I suspect most readers will assume a certain degree of autobiography here. Woolf is talking about the great difference she sees between the imaginative thinker, not especially committed to knowing the truth of a boring fact, as much as she is thinking deeply and broadly, versus the person who comes in her room, who is direct and plain, not absorbed in his own mind, but instead in the world of what Woolf might see as boring realism. The newspaper represents that. If we assume this is the story of a woman and a man, we might think Woolf is referring to two different gendered ways of approaching the world. The next story I read this week might be related in a way. An outlier time-wise on this list of stories, mostly from early in the century, Sonya Dorman's The Putnam Tradition was published in the 1960s, but it feels older. It's a work of speculative fiction, something that I don't read a ton of and don't know much about as a genre. Basically, this is the story of 3 generations of Putnam women living near the coast, as the family had for many generations before them. What makes it, I think, what would be called speculative fiction is that these women have supernatural powers, while the men in their families are, in general, engineers. If I was reading correctly, the newest generation has a combination of magic inherited by the women and this different kind of magic from her father. Like what we see in Virginia Woolf, in this story we generally get imaginative women, but men who are much more direct. There's quite a bit of discussion about change over time, how modernization is affecting their town and changing power dynamics, but also how the women's supernatural powers seem to change over the generations. I enjoyed this story, but I must admit I felt a little bit lost, and I think it might be because of my lack of familiarity with science fiction. Do any of you know this story and this author? I'd love to hear a little bit more. The third story also seems to emphasize the differences between men and women, although here we're talking not about inherited traits like in the Dorman story, but instead about sociocultural experiences. And this story has been a long time favorite of mine. Susan Glaspell's fantastic A Jury of Her Peers, written in 1917. This is an early detective story. We start with the county attorney and the sheriff on their way to an isolated farmhouse where a man has been killed. Because the man's wife is alone at the farmhouse, the attorney and sheriff request that their wives accompany them to help take care of the widow's needs. When they first walk in the house, the men start criticizing the messiness of the kitchen, which they blame on the dead man's wife. But the two visiting women realize that the story is quite a bit more complicated, that the husband, and not the wife, was the responsible party. As the lawyer and sheriff investigate the house, the women begin to notice a number of clues to who might have killed the man. They see more and more that suggest that the man might have mistreated his wife, too. They see how the sewing on a quilt top had suddenly gone from neat, controlled stitches to stitches clearly made by someone who was upset. And there's much more that they notice, too, but that the lawyer and sheriff do not. I'll let you discover all of that for yourselves, but suffice it to say that because of the experiences of the two attending wives, they deduce what must have happened in the house, and they make a decision about how to deal with that information. The two women understand it in ways the men cannot, and they decide how to deal with that information in a way that might seem like justice, or it might give you pause, or both. This is a great story, and if you haven't read it, I offer it to you with my strongest recommendation. You can read it for free online or download it from Project Gutenberg, as you can with almost all of the stories I'm going to discuss today. My fourth story of the week was written by Orne Jewett, an author I fell in love with a few years ago. The story is not one of her well-known stories, and it's entitled Miss Tempy's Watchers, written in 1888 rather than the 20th century, like the rest of the stories on this list. And it might not have been one of her best stories either, although I enjoyed it tremendously. Temperance Demp, Miss Tempy, has just died as the story begins, and this is the story of the two very different women that come to watch her body until the next day when the funeral will occur. The story really has very little plot. It's more of a character study of the two women who, over the course of the evening, grow in subtle ways because of their conversation with each other. While they talk, they knit and sew, and they share snacks. Mrs. Crow is a woman married to a prosperous farmer, while the character of Sarah Benson is a spinster who lives in poverty, helping take care of her widowed sister and her children. While both women are basically kind-hearted, Mrs. Crow is frugal and a little stern, while Miss Benson is defined more by her self-sacrificing personality. Over the course of the evening, Mrs. Crow confesses to Sarah Benson that she was moved by the model of Miss Tempy to be a more giving person. This is done in such a subtle and gentle way, not one that seems as cheesy as what my comment must sound like. I really love Jewett's style, talking about these very intimate moments between women friends. I also adore the way that place and the culture of that place plays such an important part in her writing. If you haven't read her novella, The Country of Pointed Firs, I especially recommend that. But really, everything I've read of hers has the most quiet, gentle, comforting tone I've experienced. Okay, the next story I read this week was The Gay Old Dog, published in 1917 by Edna Ferber. This was kind of a wild follow-up to Sarah Orne Jewett's story, since it too addresses the question of how giving to be, how self-sacrificing to be, albeit in a totally different way. Here, the main character is a man, Joe Hertz. When his mother is dying, he promises her that he will not marry until his three sisters are settled. And he starts the story as a responsible young man. But the burden of taking care of his family, and the family business too, effectively destroys him. His promise effectively removes Joe's possibilities of making a deeply meaningful life of his own. The narrator blames that fact on the mother, not on Joe, for accepting the request. As the narrator says, the dead have no right to lay their clammy fingers upon the living. When his sisters no longer depend on Joe, he becomes a lonely old man who spends his time indulging in youthful entertainment, since he no longer has any deep connections to anyone. He's angry too. I heard a quote somewhere saying that the story was about, quote, the emptiness of belated freedom. And that is about right. I'm intrigued by this difference in the approach to duty to others in the stories of Jewett and Ferber. There are three fairly substantial differences here that play a role in how the authors address what kind of giving behaviors are positive or negative. One is clearly gender. There was something of an expectation that women should be self-sacrificing, but men were more naturally independent. One is time period. Jewett was writing at the end of the 19th century, while Ferber was writing in the immediately post-World War I period. And then there's the kind of communities in which these two stories take place. The Gay Old Dog is in the most urban area around Chicago, while Miss Tempy's Watchers happens in a small community in a rural area. I assume that all of these factors contribute to the differences in the messages between these two stories. All right, two more stories. The first is Shirley Jackson's 1965 story, The Possibility of Evil. Jackson's most well-known story is, I assume, The Lottery, which I know a lot of fellow short story summer participants are reading this month. I first read it back when I was in middle school in a collected short story volume on my mother's shelf. What a story. From the earliest words, I kept getting this feeling of doom, even though it didn't quite make sense to me. If you're unfamiliar with the story, I certainly recommend it. This year, though, I read Jackson's The Possibility of Evil, which is similarly intense. I'm not going to hold back on so-called spoilers on this story, partly because while the slight twist at the end is indeed something one might not expect, I don't see how it would ruin the enjoyment of the story to know it was coming. If you read short stories, you're probably assuming there's going to be some twist or revelation at the end of any short story you read. And the one in this story, which comes at the very end, is what I'm most interested in talking about here. The story follows Miss Strangeworth, a spinster in her early 70s, who lives alone in her orderly house with its rose garden in the back, tended by generations in her family. She won't share her roses with anyone, not the tourists she likes to talk to, and not the community members who will only be given some of the flowers less valuable to her. She feels immense pride in her rose garden and in her related sense of great worth to the community. Miss Strangeworth also has a secret life, one where she sends anonymous letters to people in the town, sowing fear and discord throughout the community, suggesting that people should distrust their spouses or their doctors or whatever. She wanted to alert the community to the possibility of evil amongst them, as the title says. Miss Strangeworth, like the character of Joe, who we met in Edna Ferber's story, is a lonely person, and her antisocial feeling of a certain kind of responsibility gives her her own possibility of evil. Events transpire that explain how a particular community member might be able to know who wrote the letters. So at the very end of the story, She wakes up to a letter that looks quite similar to her own poison pen missives, which says only, "Look out at what used to be your roses." And there the story ends. We readers are still trying to catch a glimpse of whatever has happened in the garden, assuming that the roses were all beheaded. The abrupt ending is, I think, quite a bit more common in 20th century stories influenced by modernism. The idea of stopping at the most intense moment, not following the bell curve of action that we might see in classical drama, for example, works so well in short stories. Actually, I know some of you are reading some penny dreadfuls from the Victorian period, and I'd love to know if they ever end like this. Okay, one last story for the week. One which I'm embarrassed to say I've never read before, Katherine Mansfield's classic, The Garden Party from 1922. It's a fascinating story, and you can really see the influence of Virginia Woolf on Mansfield's prose. She's got the same kind of gentle precision to her writing, while at the same time using modernist techniques such as stream of consciousness. I definitely recommend the story, which is one of her best known stories, but I don't think I'm going to talk about it directly today. Instead, what really intrigues me here is that Mansfield's story is filled with references to Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. At first, I thought I was just finding things in the story that Mansfield in no way could have intended. But there is so much that I think I've changed my mind. To start with, we have oldest sister Meg, Jose, short for Josephine, Laura, as well as brother Laurie. In Alcott, of course, Laurie is not an actual brother, although he plays that role for a while. Josephine goes by Jo, not Jose, and the artistic sibling is not Laura, but Amy. Beth isn't explicitly referenced in this story at all, but we do see her ghost a bit in Mansfield's story, a ghost in the form of a piano. As you might remember, Little Women starts with the sisters taking their Christmas breakfast to needy neighbors, and we see a directly parallel action in the garden party. There is even a reference to a, quote, little woman. I will let you discover this and other allusions yourself, but I'd love to chat for a moment about what I think Mansfield might be trying to do here. I think she's drawing a big distinction between the portrayal of Marmee in Alcott's book and the mother we see in the garden party. Marmee is not perfect, but she is a force for great good in both her family and in the community. She's sort of the angel in the house, a phrase that comes from a Victorian poem, but is also a term that social historians use to talk about the way mothers during the 19th century were often portrayed in literature. In contrast, the mother in the Mansfield story is very much not that idealized type of woman. Still, what happens to the main character is that she grows from her experiences into a woman who sees the world in a way very different from the way her mother sees it. And that's true in Alcott, too. I do want to make one other comment. As do many stories, the garden party includes a moment of epiphany. And here it happens at the very end. And in true modernist style, it's ambiguous. We know the character has a revelation, but we don't know precisely what she now understands or sees. That new vision at the end, an understanding that changes everything, but sometimes remains ambiguous in modernist stories, is something we see in a few of the short stories I read this week. As I said, I talked a minute ago about the moment at the end of Shirley Jackson's story, which suggests that the main character has been forced to grapple with a new understanding of where things stand. And even in the other stories, starting with Woolf's The Mark on the Wall, we see something similar, I think. Well, Woolf puts the main character at the end at a new spot between what I think we can assume she saw as men's style versus women's ways of interacting with the world. So instead of living in her own world right then, she's having a bit of an epiphany about how other people think and what they value about the process of thinking. The twist epiphany here is not in the plot of the story, but instead in the mind of the main character and in the mind of the reader, which is really interesting. Well, I can't wait to hear more about what you all are reading, and I'm really looking forward to some of the stories I'm thinking about reading in this coming week. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.